"Who do those children belong to?" whispered one elderly woman to her companion as they sat on a bench late one evening. The last traces of summer were fading, with the sun dipping below the horizon and birds filling the air with their final songs. The soft hum of music drifted over from a nearby cafe, creating a backdrop for the two elderly women, known in the neighbourhood as the leading gossips of their block. Their smiles were friendly enough, but behind closed doors, their tongues sharpened to spread whispers and critiques about everyone. "That's Trina Preston. She has 4 kids now. They say each one's from a different father." "Young folks these days have no boundaries," one of them remarked. No, she's married," corrected the other. "She only has 1 child, with her husband, I believe. The others, she took them in after her friend died in an accident." "Really? I hadn't heard that." The other woman's eyes widened. "Yes, it's true. She felt sorry for the children and brought them into her home. It's a decent-sized apartment, but with 4 kids, it must feel like a shoebox. And the oldest is finishing high school this year and heading to college." "Which one is her biological child?" "The youngest boy. Her friend was older, so naturally her children are older than Trina's." "Shh, she's coming over now." Trina approached, her ears catching their conversation. She felt a momentary urge to tell them to mind their own business, but decided against wasting her energy. Instead, she offered a warm smile as she passed by, and her children echoed her greeting. They walked into the building and began the climb up the stairs. Holly, Marcy's eldest daughter, led the way. Trina held the small hand of her own son Travis, who was nearing 4 and had dark curly hair, a miniature version of his father. Behind them trailed Ben, Marcy's middle child, and little Tessa, the youngest, with her quiet, observant eyes. Trina, with her petite frame and radiant skin, often drew admiring glances from men, though her husband Calvin remained indifferent to such attention, just as he seemed detached from her presence. Trina and Marcy were more than childhood friends. They were as close as sisters. Both had grown up as only children, with no siblings to rely on for support. Marcy, 4 years older, had always been Trina's protector and confidant. She had once even saved Trina's life after a group of boys playfully pushed her off a bridge, unaware that 11-year-old Trina couldn't swim. Marcy, despite having just come out of the hospital after a dog bite that needed 15 stitches, jumped into the water without second thought and pulled Trina to safety. The act left Marcy with a severe infection that nearly cost her life. Marcy eventually moved to the city after finishing school, and while their contact became less frequent, they remained in touch. Marcy's life took a sharp turn when she became pregnant while still in college. Trina offered unwavering support through that difficult time. Vincent, Marcy's boyfriend, was resistant to commitment, and their relationship was fraught with arguments and tears. However, things settled when they married, and over time, they had 3 children. Even after gaining weight from her pregnancies, Marcy's beauty remained undeniable, and Vincent's love persisted despite their frequent bickering. Trina was a constant guest at their house, and it was Vincent who introduced her to Calvin, his best friend. They began dating and eventually married. Trina had struggled with infertility for years, but finally, their long-desired son Travis was born. On the day of the accident that took Vincent and Marcy's lives, Trina was watching their children. The couple had set out to choose new wallpaper for the nursery. Marcy wanted a neutral beige, while Vincent argued for something more cheerful, hoping that if their kids saw the bright colours, they would side with him and diffuse Marcy's objections. They were known for their playful squabbles, but whenever Marcy felt down, Vincent would lift her up, spin her around, and make her laugh away her worries. That morning, as the family prepared to leave, Tessa started to cry, clutching her throat. "Her throat hurts. Let her stay," Marcy said with a concerned frown. Ben, ever protective of his little sister, chimed in. "Can I stay too? I don't want to go pick wallpaper. It's boring." Marcy turned to Holly, seeking her opinion. "Sure, Mum. I'll stay too," Holly agreed with a smile. Marcy's expression softened with gratitude. She promised she wouldn't be long and drove away with Vincent, neither of them knowing it was the last time their children would see them. Just minutes before reaching the store, a crash claimed both of their lives. The children were inconsolable at the funeral, clinging to each other and overwhelmed by loss. It was then Trina made a life-altering decision. "They won't go to an orphanage. I'll take them in," she declared. "Are you serious? 3 at once? Take the oldest one at least, she'll be of help," Calvin objected. "How can you be so unfeeling? They just lost their parents. Their whole world has been shattered. They need each other now more than ever. And don't forget, Vincent was your best friend," Trina retorted. Their arguments had stretched on for days. Frustrated, Trina took it upon herself to start gathering the necessary documents, even without Calvin's full consent. Eventually, the authorities approved her request, and Marcy's children were placed under her care. What had once felt like ample space in Calvin's apartment now seemed cramped with 6 people under one roof. The tension between Trina and Calvin grew, and he often voiced his frustration. "Why did we have to take them all? Why didn't you listen to me? Don't I get a say in this?" he would snap. Trina struggled to comprehend his lack of empathy. "This isn't up for debate. Marcy was like a sister to me. She saved my life once. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't be here today. The least I can do is ensure her children don't end up in an orphanage. I'll be their mother, their family. You need to decide for yourself. Support me or not. But I'm not changing my mind," she said, deeply hurt by Calvin's indifference. Their marriage, already fragile, began to splinter. While Marcy and Vincent had their share of loud arguments, followed by affectionate reconciliations, Trina and Calvin had grown silent and detached over time. Trina often felt as if they were strangers, pretending to share a life, each absorbed in their own world. Calvin, determined to avoid working for anyone else, dabbled in small business ventures, buying items cheaply to resell at a profit and renting a truck for various deliveries. He even had a small office, a solitary room where he spent days and nights, claiming he was crafting a new business strategy. In reality, these plans either floundered or required financial input that strained their budget, leaving Trina frustrated when he dipped into the family's funds. The allowance Trina received for Marcy's children initially sparked Calvin's resistance, but shifted when the first payment arrived. "This is a gold mine!" he exclaimed with excitement. Trina's response was firm. "That money is meant for the children." Nevertheless, Calvin started pressuring her for cash nearly every month. A year passed, and the initial challenges gradually transformed. Holly, Marcy's eldest, harboured resentment toward Trina at first, suspecting that she was trying to take her mother's place. Over time, Holly came to see Trina's genuine care and began confiding in her. Trina supported her through teenage challenges, including taking her to the doctor for a routine visit. At 16, Holly had a boyfriend, whom Trina welcomed like one of their own, laughing with him and serving him meals just as Marcy would have done. Calvin's presence at home became more sporadic as he stayed late at work more often. Trina, consumed by her responsibilities, began to realise that their resources were stretched too thin, so she searched for part-time work. One day, Mrs. Henson, an elderly neighbour who sometimes helped Trina with the children, suggested an idea. "Why don't you try working as a wife for an hour?" "What do you mean?" Trina asked, puzzled. "My daughter-in-law works for a company like that. You do tasks like cleaning someone's house before their parents visit or babysitting. Wealthy young folks often hire help because they're too busy or too lazy. The pay is decent. You only need to follow instructions, and you earn about 70% after the firm takes its share. The only catch is you have to keep up a good rating. If you're rude or don't meet expectations, it'll show on your profile. But you're hardworking, Trina. I know you'd do well." Trina mulled it over and decided to try. If she could work discreetly, she could spend the money on the children, giving them little joys, like the new phone Holly had been hoping for. The basic phone Holly had been using for a year made it hard for her to stay connected with her friends. Taking Mrs. Henson's advice, Trina went to the firm's office. The boss, who had also taken in his late brother's 2 children, sympathised with her situation and hired her quickly. On her first day, Trina earned enough to return home with treats and a special dinner. It wasn't enough for a phone yet, but it brightened everyone's evening. "Where's Calvin?" Holly asked as they sat around the table. "I'm not sure. Working late, I suppose," Trina replied with a shrug. Calvin had become the least of her worries. He no longer contributed to the household in any meaningful way. The money he did take from the children's allowance now only added to her burden. Even his grocery shopping had dwindled to nothing, replaced by complaints and dirty laundry. Trina continued to take on part-time work regularly. Within a couple of weeks, she managed to save up enough for a new phone for Holly and some clothes for the younger children. On that day, after sending the kids to school and kindergarten, Trina received a job notification and headed to the office. A short while later, she stood before an imposing mansion, ready for her next assignment. "Are you from the agency? Come in," a stunning young woman greeted Trina with effortless confidence. She was so impeccably beautiful that Trina couldn't help but wonder if regular visits to beauty salons were her secret. If Trina only put more effort into self-care, she thought, maybe she could look as radiant. The hostess appeared to be about her age, but the house was in disarray. Without further conversation, the woman disappeared into her bedroom, leaving Trina with the housekeeper, who managed the daily cleaning, cooking and laundry. The housekeeper showed Trina the areas needing attention. This assignment took Trina longer than usual. The chaos left by affluent residents was more extensive than expected. Just as she was nearly done, her eyes caught a photograph on a table, and she froze. Calvin was there, smiling at her from inside the frame. Disbelief coursed through her as she picked up the picture. This couldn't be real. Her first panicked thought was that Calvin had a secret life, perhaps a wealthy background he had hidden from her. But she shook her head. That didn't fit. The simplest explanation was that it was just someone who bore an uncanny resemblance. But the likeness was too striking to ignore. Could he have a twin? And if he did that mean Travis had an uncle she didn't know about, possibly with children of his own in this very house? These thoughts swirled in her mind as she absent-mindedly polished the bathroom until it gleamed. "That's enough for today. You've done more than I expected," the elderly housekeeper said, smiling approvingly. "You're thorough and hard-working. I'll be sure to call on you again. Would that be all right?" Trina returned the smile. "Of course, I'd be happy to." "Good, it's settled then." Before leaving, Trina left her contact details and couldn't resist glancing at the portraits one last time. "Who is the man in this picture?" she asked. The housekeeper's smile faded. "We're not really supposed to talk about the family, but since you're curious, that's Kim's new boyfriend. He's quite the scoundrel and already planning marriage, even though Kim's father Simon can't stand him. Neither can I. He's arrogant, but Kim is in love. Her father tried to intervene, and it led to a huge argument." Trina nodded and, after exchanging goodbyes, walked home deep in thought. Calvin was already there, adjusting his tie and checking himself in the mirror. "I have a business meeting at my office today. I'll be home late," he said. Trina perched on the edge of the bed, memories flickering through her mind about when he first started spending more time at his office. "What's the meeting about?" she asked. "It's about trendy toys. I'm planning to buy them wholesale and make a big profit," he replied, grinning. "I need some cash for a bouquet. A brother and sister are attending the meeting. They run a family business in the toy market, and I want to make an impression." Trina sighed, her trust wavering, but handed him half of what she had just earned. Calvin took the money with a broad smile and left. Restless, Trina remembered the address of Calvin's office. With an hour to spare before picking up Travis from kindergarten, she decided to visit. Her plan was simple. She wanted to tell Calvin he might have a twin and gauge his reaction. She stepped off the bus and paused, unsure of where to go next. A musician played near the entrance of the shopping centre, a young man with an unkempt appearance that made it hard to tell if he was homeless or simply fashionably dishevelled. "Want me to play you a song?" he asked, his voice friendly. Trina offered an apologetic smile. Sorry, I don't have any money. Neither do I, he joked with a grin, but that's not why I asked. His bright blue eyes caught her off guard, and for a moment she forgot why she was there. His curly blonde hair and youthful energy made him look even younger than he probably was, early 30s at most. He cradled an old guitar and began strumming her favourite song, singing with a voice that was unexpectedly captivating. Why, that song? She asked when he finished. It's my favourite, he said with a smile. You're really talented, Trina told him. A glance at her watch snapped her back to reality. She thanked him, said goodbye, and hurried on her way. When she arrived at Calvin's office building, an unexpected apprehension settled over her. Bracing herself, she reached for the door. Who are you here to see? A security guard called out. This was my husband's office, she replied. The guard raised an eyebrow. This office hasn't been rented in 6 months. The cleaning staff uses it as storage now. He opened the door, revealing the familiar but now dusty space. Same wallpaper, same desk with the broken leg, now repurposed as a utility room. Trina thanked the guard and hurried toward the bus stop, her chest heavy with emotion. She deliberately chose a different route to avoid passing by the street musician. She couldn't bear the thought of him seeing her so upset and possibly offering to play another song. Once on the bus, she headed to the kindergarten. After listening to the teacher's complaints and picking up the children, she brought them home, prepared dinner, greeted the older kids returning from school, helped them with their clothes, listened to their stories about classmates and teachers, and cleared the table. Let me handle the dishes and you should rest. You look upset, Holly said. Trina felt a pang of gratitude. Holly, so much like her late mother, was always perceptive, noticing even the smallest shifts in Trina's mood and helping out without being asked. That night, Calvin didn't return home. He sent a message saying he would be late and wouldn't be back until the following day, claiming that his new business partners had invited him to see a warehouse in a neighbouring state. The lie was so poorly constructed that Trina felt a mix of anger and pity. How did he ever expect to succeed as a businessman with such flimsy excuses? Trina lay awake, sleep refusing to come. Calvin finally returned the next day, his lies delivered with an unsettling confidence. He didn't ask how their son was or how she was holding up. He was too absorbed in his own thoughts. This time, Trina's eyes were opened. She resolved to follow him, determined to see the truth with her own eyes. After staying home just long enough to eat, Calvin left again. Trina's mind churned with disgust, realising he had likely used her hard-earned money for a bouquet meant for his mistress. Trina trailed him and was struck numb when he walked straight into Kim's house. Kim greeted him at the door, throwing her arms around his neck. Well, I don't greet him like that, Trina muttered to herself, quickening her pace. The door wasn't locked, so she stepped aside and found Calvin and Kim on the couch in the elegant living room, the same one she'd scrubbed clean the day before. How could you? Trina's voice trembled with disbelief. Calvin spun around, stunned into silence. Kim, still unaware of the situation, spoke coldly. And what do you think you're doing? You're the new cleaner, aren't you? Yes, I am your cleaner, and the man sitting next to you is my husband. Legally mine, Trina said, her voice breaking with anger. Kim, sweetheart, let me explain, Calvin stammered, scrambling for an excuse. We have a child together, Trina continued, ignoring him and addressing Kim directly. What kind of man invades someone else's family like this? Kim stood up unfazed. Figure it out between yourselves, she said before walking out of the room. Trina, unable to hold back her fury, grabbed a vase from the table and hurled it at Calvin. He ducked, and the vase shattered on the floor. The adrenaline left her body as suddenly as it had come, replaced by an empty sadness. She approached Calvin, stared at him for a moment, and then slapped him so hard that he gasped. Without another word, she turned and left. I'm going to divorce you, she said, her voice firm but weary. You're crazy! You can't control yourself, he called after her, his voice filled with disbelief. Trina walked home, tears streaming down her face uncontrollably. At the entrance, Mrs. Henson, her helpful neighbour, noticed her distress. "What's wrong, dear? Come in. I'll make you some chamomile tea. It helps with inflammation. And valerian is good for calming down," the older woman said, leading Trina inside. "Yes, you know best," Trina whispered, still sobbing. 10 minutes later, Trina sat holding a cup of tea with chamomile and valerian, struggling to steady her voice as she recounted everything that had happened. "What are you going to do now?" Mrs. Henson asked, her brow creased with concern. "I'm going to pack our things. I can't stay under the same roof as him anymore. The tenants just moved out of Marcy's old apartment. I was planning to find new renters, but maybe you and the kids should move in." "Won't it be difficult for them? That place is full of memories," Mrs. Henson said gently. Trina paused, considering. "You're right. But if I redecorate, maybe it will feel new. I'll put up new wallpaper like Marcy wanted and we'll start fresh." Over the next 2 days, Trina threw herself into transforming the apartment. She rearranged furniture, tore out old carpets, and changed the wallpaper in one room. The physical work was exhausting, but it was also a distraction from the pain. During that time, Mrs. Henson looked after the children. When the last of the repairs were complete, Trina surveyed the space with a bittersweet sense of achievement. "It's done. Everything's packed. We're ready to move," she said, her voice barely masking her exhaustion. Her body ached from the effort, and she was down to her last bit of money. Cleaning had always been therapeutic for her, but this time it had drained her completely. The following morning, Trina and the children moved into their new apartment. That evening, Holly had to call an ambulance after Trina suddenly fell ill and fainted. At the hospital, Trina regained consciousness, but the doctors insisted on further tests. The ultrasound revealed something completely unexpected. "From what we can tell, there's nothing threatening your pregnancy, but you must take care of yourself. Fainting could be a sign of overexertion, so you need to prioritise your health," the doctor advised. Trina was stunned. A pregnancy was the last thing she needed. She already had 4 children to care for and was planning a divorce from a husband she wanted out of her life for good. How could she possibly manage this new reality? After the initial shock, Trina asked to be discharged, needing time to think. On one hand, she felt utterly unprepared for the mental, physical, and financial toll of a 5th child. But on the other, she knew she could never bring herself to end a pregnancy. No matter what Calvin had done, the unborn child was innocent, part of her. Travis had brought so much joy into her life, and Marcy's children had become her own. She shared her news with Mrs. Henson over the phone. "Oh, dear. I remember when I was young, I committed that sin. It was hard back then. And even though medical procedures are safer now, are you sure this is what you want?" "Think it over, honey," Mrs. Henson said gently. Trina held her smartphone with its cracked screen firmly in her hand and replied, "No, I've made my decision. I'm going to have this baby." Later that day, Trina gathered the children and shared the news. "We're going to have a new baby, brother or sister soon." "But you're not our real mum," Tessa said, her small face scrunched up in confusion. Trina smiled warmly. "No, I'm not your biological mom, but I love you all the same. You're all my children." Tessa's frown disappeared, replaced with excitement. "I want a little sister, so we can play with dolls together," she squealed. Ben chimed in, "No way. We need a boy. I already have enough sisters." From that moment, Holly wouldn't let Trina lift anything heavier than a teacup. She looked after her with a care that made Trina's heart ache with gratitude, although the surge of hormones might have been to blame for her tears. Trina worked even harder, driven by the desire to prepare for the baby's arrival. She wanted to buy a crib, toys, and other necessities. But Calvin, despite being Travis's father and the legal guardian of Marcy's children, refused to contribute. If not for him, Trina wouldn't have been granted custody of Marcy's children at all. "I get that you're only a guardian on paper, and I don't expect you to take responsibility for Marcy's kids. But Travis is your son, and I'm pregnant with your child. We need help with daycare fees and household expenses, she said, trying to reason with him. Pregnant with my child? Don't be ridiculous. And don't call me again asking for money, you extortionist. That baby isn't mine, Calvin retorted. His voice was cold, and Trina knew he was more concerned about protecting his relationship with Kim and her father's wealth. Regret washed over Trina for having told Calvin about the pregnancy. She was desperate for money, so she pushed herself to take on 3 or 4 cleaning jobs a day. After a week of relentless work, the strain caught up with her. One afternoon, as the children were at school, she collapsed from exhaustion, bleeding heavily. She lost consciousness on the way to the hospital. When she woke up, the doctor's expression was serious. You're out of immediate danger, but you'll need to stay with us for a while. You'll still be able to have children in the future, but this time, I'm very sorry. The words cut through Trina's heart like a knife. I lost my baby, she whispered in horror. Yes, it was a miscarriage due to overexertion. You had internal bleeding, but you were brought in just in time, the doctor explained. Trina stared blankly at the wall, her mind numb. She wept through the day and into the night. Holly visited daily until the doctor finally said Trina could go home. Don't worry, Trina. I've already told everyone that there won't be a new baby yet. You don't need to explain anything, Holly said, her voice laced with anger. When Trina confided in Holly about Calvin's betrayal, his refusal to help, and his denial of the baby, Holly's eyes flashed with rage. It's all Calvin's fault. He's such a jerk. Thank you, Holly. I don't think I could have faced telling them myself. They were so excited for a little brother or sister. It's better this way, Trina. One day, you'll have children with a man who deserves you, not that traitor, Holly said. Back at home, the children surrounded Trina, eager to tell her about their day. Travis climbed into her lap and looked up at her with wide eyes. So, is the stork late bringing the baby? Trina nodded slowly. Yes, sweetheart. It turns out the stork decided to take the baby to another family first. They don't have any children and they needed him more. He said he'd bring one to us later. Is that okay? Are you upset? She asked, improvising on the spot. Travis shook his head. No, Mum, that's okay. Can I have some Lego instead? Trina exhaled softly. Of course, my love, of course. Trina had to rebuild her life from the ground up. Gathering her strength, she returned to her job, taking on tasks for wealthy families almost daily. The pay was decent, and with the children's allowances, she managed to make ends meet. Life continued as usual. One day, while on her way home, Trina saw the street musician again, the man with the guitar who had once played her favourite song. He was surrounded by people tossing coins into his hat. She intended to walk past without stopping, but he changed his tune to one she recognised instantly. Trina paused, realising he was playing for her. Well, hello. He greeted her when she turned. Hi, I didn't mean to disturb you, Trina replied. I've been hoping to see you again. Can I buy you a coffee? He offered. Trina hesitated. Though his clothes were worn, his clean-shaven face and poised manner suggested he wasn't just a drifter. They sat at an outdoor cafe and talked about music. The conversation felt effortless, almost magical. Though she barely knew him, Trina relished the freedom of those moments, doing something because she wanted to, not because she had to. His name was Oscar, and he was full of light-hearted stories about street musicians he'd encountered. Trina laughed, more than she had in months. Can I see you again? Oscar asked. Trina sighed, knowing he didn't understand the complexity of her life. I have 4 children, Oscar. Perfect. Bring them here tomorrow. I'd love to meet them. You know, I thought you were barely 18 when I first saw you, he joked. Trina smiled. You're sweet. All right, I'll bring them, but you'll have to play their favourite songs. That evening, Trina felt lighter, her heart warmed by the simple joy of anticipation. The next day, she brought her children to meet Oscar. He greeted them with a smile and entertained them with music and playful riddles. It was a joyous afternoon. Afterward, he invited them all to a cafe and treated them, using an expensive wallet and a card, never touching the money from his street performance. "Who are you, really?" Trina asked, intrigued. Oscar grinned mischievously. "An undercover agent," he said with a wink. "Seriously," Trina pressed. But Oscar sidestepped the question, changing the subject. Their meetings became a regular occurrence, and Trina found herself looking forward to these moments of laughter and companionship. One day, Trina baked a cake and decided to surprise Oscar. The cake had turned out perfectly, and she was eager to share it with him. "Are you performing at the usual spots?" she called. "Don't come today. I can't talk now," Oscar said abruptly, ending the call. Worried, Trina decided to deliver the cake quickly and leave. As she approached the familiar corner, she heard music. "He must be performing for tips," she thought. But when she got closer, she saw Oscar toss his guitar aside and chase after a man. The man stopped, turning back to face Oscar with a knife. They moved closer to Trina's position, and Oscar's eyes met hers just as the man lunged and stabbed him. Trina screamed, the cake slipping from her hands and crashing to the ground. The assailant noticed her and stepped forward, knife raised. A gun shot rang out, deafening her. When she opened her eyes, the man was on the ground, lifeless. Oscar lay face down, blood soaking his shirt. Trina composed herself enough to call an ambulance, pressing her hands to Oscar's wound. He regained consciousness briefly. "What did he take from you? Was it money?" Trina asked frantically. "He was selling drugs to kids. I told you I'm an undercover cop," Oscar whispered before losing consciousness again. "Please don't die," Trina pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "It's not my first time. I'll be fine," he murmured before passing out. At the hospital, Trina identified herself as Oscar's girlfriend to stay by his side. While she waited, police officers confirmed that Oscar Finley was indeed an undercover officer working to dismantle a local drug ring. His musical talent had made him a perfect candidate for the mission. "He saved my life," Trina told one officer, who responded with a knowing smile. "He's single, you know," the officer added with a wink. But Trina only cared about Oscar's safety as the surgery continued. Hours passed, and then a slender woman rushed into the corridor. Trina's heart dropped. It was Kim. "You!" Trina gasped. Kim's face hardened. "I don't care about you. What's happening with Oscar? Why are you here?" Trina stared stunned as Kim's bravado crumbled into tears. Trina instinctively reached out and guided her to a chair. "Calm down, he's in surgery. I'll tell you what happened," Trina said gently. She explained how she'd met Oscar and the events of the day. "I'm his sister," Kim admitted after hearing the story. "Oscar and our father never got along. Dad's in business, and Oscar values honesty and justice too much for that. He left home, joined the police, and never took a dime from Dad, even though he set up an account for him. I'm stuck between them. When Mum died last year from cancer, Dad was devastated. He begged Oscar to come home and take over the business, but Oscar refused. He just wanted his son back, not the money or the company. Dad doesn't know about Oscar's injury yet. If anything happens, it'll break him." Trina's anger at Kim melted away as they sat side by side waiting in the hospital corridor. "Forgive me," Kim said suddenly. "Calvin told me his wife was unfaithful, that she made him adopt children that weren't his. He lied so much, and that's why I acted the way I did." "Calvin is all about money, Kim. I'm sorry, but you need to hear this," Trina replied. She told Kim how Calvin avoided real work, resented taking in Marcy's children despite living off their allowance, and even took money from her for flowers meant for Kim. Kim listened quietly, eyes wide with realization. "I had a failed romance before I met Calvin, and I just lost my head when he came into my life. He surrounded me with attention and care," Kim admitted. "I'm not naive. I noticed he seemed interested in my status, but I was desperate then. His marriage didn't matter to me because he told me that you and he were no longer living as husband and wife." Trina's expression darkened. When I confronted you at your house, I was pregnant. Calvin was the only man I'd ever been with. Kim's eyes widened in shock. But we were already planning our wedding. He swore he didn't live with you and was staying with a friend. She shook her head, a mixture of disbelief and anguish clouding her face. Today has turned my whole world upside down. If Oscar doesn't quit this job, I'm going to strangle him myself, she added, tears streaming down her cheeks. Trina managed a small smile. He won't quit, not from what I've seen of him. Kim nodded, a tearful smile breaking through. Yeah, that sounds like him. Just then, the doctor emerged with good news. The surgery had been a success, and he explained that if Trina hadn't acted quickly to turn Oscar over and clamp his wound, he wouldn't have made it to the hospital. Everyone exhaled with relief. The hardest part was over. Now all that remained was for Oscar to heal. After their talk, Kim ended her relationship with Calvin without hesitation. He began calling Trina, implying darkly that if she didn't take him back, he'd make sure her children were taken away. When Kim heard this, she called him and spoke with an icy resolve. If you go near my brother's fiancée again, I'll tell my father, and he'll deal with you personally. Do you understand? You're despicable. Forget about her, she warned. Calvin was stunned. He knew full well that Kim's father had connections that handled problems in an unsavoury manner. Shaken, he promised to stay away from Trina, and she never heard from him again. Oscar's recovery was steady, and though he didn't return to live at his father's house, the incident had mended their relationship. Trina and Kim grew close, almost like sisters. Kim, though still a bit spoiled and whimsical, admired Trina, who was raising 4 children on her own, with unwavering kindness and compassion. Trina and Oscar's relationship blossomed rapidly. When Oscar proposed, Trina knew she couldn't say no. His father, grateful to have his son safe and rebuilding the ties, organised a grand wedding. A year later, the couple welcomed twins, 2 beautiful, lively babies, into their already loving family. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our next one. Have a wonderful day.